shut you down. You gotta stand up and fight. Got to stand up. Don't shut you down. You gotta stand up and fight.
Alright, so for this tutorial, I've just set up a live server so that we can make changes to the CSS and HTML on the right and just immediately see what it looks like on the left. And before we get started, the most important thing to understand about CSS and how it works under the hood is to understand that CSS properties like margin, width, border, any property that you can specify, are only implemented in certain layouts. So what I mean by that is flow layout is the default layout. It's also just called normal layout. Most of people don't know its name exactly because it's the default. But other layouts that people are more familiar with are, for example, the Flexbox layout, grid layout, you have position layouts. These are all different layouts in CSS. And in those layouts, certain properties are actually implemented. So, for example, let's say I had just a class called zIndex. And I here add a zIndex of 10. zIndex is a property that's only implemented in, for example, Flexbox layout and grid layout. It's not implemented in the default flow layout. So any HTML tag that wants to use this zIndex property needs to actually opt in to a layout that implements it, for example, Flexbox. And that's what can sometimes make CSS feel a little bit inconsistent, is that the margin X auto property sometimes centers an element and sometimes doesn't. And that's because that property is just implemented in a certain layout. So that's the first mental model you can kind of have in your mind. If a property isn't working and you know that sometimes it does work, you should ask yourself, is this a property that is implemented in the layout that I'm using? All right, but enough talking about hypothetical. What are some of these layouts that we often use? So flow layout, that's the default one. If you don't specify, you're in flow layout. Another common layout you can have is the Flexbox layout. This one is the one I use the most often, and I think the one that most people use the most often. So Flexbox layout is another one. You have positioned layout. And this is the one where you can say, for example, position is relative or absolute or fixed or sticky. That opts into a different layout called position layout. You have grid layout. And these, I would say, are the four main layouts that you use in CSS. All right, so let's look at the default flow layout and look at how some of the HTML tags and their properties are implemented in that layout. So here we can just make a div, and here we will just add this box tag, which just adds a bit of padding and border to it. So class is equal to a box, like that. So now we have a basic box, and to skip through the stuff that most people know, display block. So that's just a regular div. If I have div, the default display is block, and the default layout is this flow layout. And in this mode, most people know, right? Things stack vertically. So if I have here test, and then I make a couple more of these, each of these things stack vertically. They each take up the full width of the parent layout. So by default, they take up the full width. They create line breaks. So here in between, they're not touching each other. There's like a default break between each block. And they respect the box model. So each of these can then have a class of box, for example. And that will add padding to it and margin and border, for example. So that's how block elements behave in flow layout. So most people know that, but how do inline elements behave? So inline elements behave a bit different, and we can see that if, for example, we add class box to all of these block elements. So now we can see that they do indeed take the full width by default. But now we add a different div with, again, this class box, and we test what it looks like with class inline. And here we can add test and also box. We can see that inline elements don't take up the full width by default. They only take the width that is necessary to actually display what you're trying to display. So that's why in this the border does not go all the way to the end. And also, this is the first example of what I was talking about earlier, where certain CSS properties are only implemented in certain layouts. So if we look at this fixed width element class, if we apply that to this display block element, we'll see that it listens to the CSS class. It changes its width to be the size that we told it to be. But in inline, that size is not implemented. So the whole CSS property width is ignored in inline. So if I add that, nothing's going to change about the width of this inline element. So what do we use inline for? If I just quickly move my face to the right side so we can see the left better. Inline it treats every child element or every element as a character. So it will just keep flowing from left to right on the page until it eventually flows to the next line. And this is what makes inline special. It has this ability to line break. So if we add a couple of divs to this, all with the same classes, we'll see that they start to fill up the width, only the necessary width. And if we add one more, we can start to see something interesting. If we keep adding a couple tests to make this longer, looks like we need one more, we will see that what happens is this container line breaks. It flows to the next line of the page as if the entire container is just text. And this explains the next point of inline that I wanted to make, and that's that it doesn't respect the box model completely. So what we saw with these div elements that were display block is that we can add margin to them. So if we add margin bottom, so we take this class a lot of margin and we add it to this one, we can see that it respects the box model. It actually pushes its elements down. But with inline elements, that's not the case. And that's because of this scenario right here. If we were to add the same bottom margin to this element, what would that mean? Would it mean add margin left to this container plus this container? Or in this case, if it doesn't line break, would it mean only to this container? It's a bit ambiguous. And because inline is meant to just be for characters, the box model is not respected in the vertical direction, only in the horizontal direction. So you can add padding and margin left and right, but not top to bottom. Another thing that maybe some people noticed is that the padding in this container here is not being applied in a way we're used to. If we look at this class box, this applies a padding to this box. But if we remove the CSS class names like this, it becomes more clear that the padding is only pushing down the text. Any border that we add or any padding that we add to these inline elements doesn't get pushed down by a padding. And for the last display mode that's relevant for flow layout, let's take a look at inline block. So if we add an inline block here and we set it to display inline block, and then we add another container here, let's say div class inline block, and now here we add test, and also let's add the box so we can see it a bit more. The first thing we'll notice is that this inline block element is a bit bigger than the inline elements, and that is because the browser has randomly decided to give this text a bit of a bigger height. So here you can see that the inline block element is 67 pixels, whereas here it's just 61 pixels. Now, inline block behaves a lot like just a regular inline element, except that it doesn't line wrap or line break. So if I keep adding different inline blocks here, the next one will just appear on the next line. It won't behave like this situation. And what this means is that the box model is now once again restored fully. So you can use it in the horizontal and in the vertical direction. But yeah, the concepts of how these different display work in different layout modes, I think is what most people using CSS lack. They just find a way to hack things together, and they found tricks that just fix certain edge case situations. And if you just take the time to maybe look at the docs and understand this, you'll save a lot more time than remembering all of these tricks or getting AI to fix it for you. So that's something I've been trying to work on. And to be honest, this was just one part of CSS. Now there's still Flexbox layout, position layout, and grid that all have their own implementations of different CSS properties. But I was thinking about maybe making that into a separate video depending on how much people appreciated this video, and maybe just using the animation software I learned in my previous videos to kind of show how the algorithm for Flexbox works. But yeah, let me know how everyone enjoyed this video. Always looking for feedback, and hopefully I can get back to making one video a week.